The image that will not leave me is of a low concrete room where the air felt cold even in midsummer, the light from our flashlights sliding over damp walls and rust-streaked corners. In the center of that floor sat a squat metal safe, its surface eaten away by time, the lid warped, as if something inside had pushed upward and then gone still. Dust floated in the beam like pale smoke, and there was a faint smell of wet rock and old iron that clung to the back of my throat. Every sound we made in that room, boots on the grit, a cough, a whispered word echoed back with a hollow metallic ring, as if the walls themselves remembered. The safe was mottled with reddish flakes, cold under gloved hands, the metal rough like sandpaper where age had bitten in. Overhead, the ventilation pipe gave off a soft, empty hum when the outside wind shifted, sending a draft of colder air across my face. For a long moment, no one spoke. We just listened to that thin breath of air moving through the pipe and the quiet creak of the door behind us. Somewhere in that heavy silence, I could feel a presence that wasn't there anymore, like a voice trapped between the concrete and the rusted steel. I remember thinking, as the smell of mold and metal filled my lungs, that some rooms are built to be forgotten, and some refuse to let you. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from, and follow if you believe some names should never fade. Back before any of that came to light, before the concrete and the rust and the echoes, my world was much smaller and much more ordinary. My days in the fall of 2016 started the same way most of them had for years. The sound of the furnace kicking on just before dawn, the faint tick of metal heating in the basement, and the smell of old coffee grounds when I stepped into the kitchen. Out my front window, the morning light would come in soft over the ridge, painting the tops of the cottonwoods in the valley a pale gold while the lower branches stayed in shadow. Durango moved slowly at that hour, dog walkers in jackets with their breath showing in the cool air, a delivery truck rattling over the cracked asphalt, the distant whine of a train whistle drifting up from town. I'd stand there with a mug warming my hands, listening to tires crunch on the gravel shoulder, and watching the neighborhood wake up, each little sound layering over the next, until it felt like the day had finally taken a first full breath. 2 doors down the house with the blue porch came to life on a different rhythm than mine. I was already retired by then. Laura was just heading into what she called her second wind. On the mornings when she'd worked a night shift, I'd see her pull into the drive as the sky turned from ink to gray, the clinic badge still clipped to her collar, the Subaru's engine ticking softly in the chill as it cooled. Sometimes she'd walk up the steps in that quiet, measured way of hers, a small paper bag from the hospital cafeteria in one hand, and her phone in the other, shoulders a little slumped from 13 hours on her feet. Other days, when she had a night off, the house would stay dark until the sun was already up. The porch light timed to click off with a faint electric pop, just as the day brightened. There was something comforting about that consistency, the way the warm yellow lamp on that blue porch would blink out at almost the same moment the sunlight hit the frost on my lawn and turned it into a damp shine. Rachel ran on a school schedule, and you could almost set your watch by her car door. At 7:15, nearly every weekday, the sound of it closing solid, not slammed, would float down the street, followed by the quick squeal of sneakers on the steps and the beep of the Subaru unlocking. I'd watch her sometimes as she hurried out, arms full of portfolios and canvas tote bags, her dark hair pulled back in a rushed ponytail that brushed her collar. When the weather was colder, she favored a worn green jacket, whose sleeves had a dusting of chalk or charcoal most mornings, a sign she'd stayed up late grading or sketching at the kitchen table the night before. The exhaust from the car would curl white in the crisp air as she backed out. Radio turned down low enough that I could catch only the faintest murmur of music through the closed windows. Then she'd head toward town taillights, briefly cutting through the thin river fog that sometimes crept up the road and made everything look softer, as if the day hadn't quite decided to be real yet. I knew them first as the nurse's car and the art teacher because that's how Patricia introduced them. Patricia's house sits between theirs and mine, a low ranch with a gravel drive and a wind chime that rings more than it should whenever the Animas River wind shifts. One late afternoon at the mailbox, with leaves skittering along the pavement and the air smelling faintly of wood smoke from someone's stove, she nodded toward the blue porch and said, "They're good girls. They keep to themselves, but they help everyone." Over time, I learned their real names. Learned that Laura was the one you called if you twisted an ankle, shoveling snow, or woke up worried about a strange pain, and that Rachel was the person the neighborhood kids went to when they needed supplies for a last-minute poster or a costume. They were different from the older families on the street, quieter, more private, but they fit into the pattern of our lives like they'd always been there. Another pair of headlights in the evening, another set of footsteps on the sidewalk when the sun went down. The town itself had its own steady heartbeat that autumn. Durango in late October is a mixture of bright days and early dark, the sun slipping behind the mountains sooner than you think it should, and leaving the streets colder than they look. In the mornings, you'd smell cold metal and damp gravel walking past the parked cars, and by afternoon, the scent of coffee and chili would float out from the cafes downtown when someone opened a door. The trains heading north toward Silverton sent a low rumble through the valley that you felt in your chest more than you heard in your ears, a reminder of tourists and history and old mining ghosts. At the Saturday market, held under a line of thinning cottonwoods, vendors sold late apples and jars of jam while kids kicked at piles of leaves that stuck wet to their shoes. I started to notice that whenever I came by for tomatoes or fresh bread, Laura and Rachel would be there too, side by side behind one of the stalls, or moving slowly down the row, fingers brushing produce, talking quietly. Their presence blended into the background noise, laughter, a guitar on a corner, the soft buzz of conversation rising and falling like the wind. Over time, I picked up on patterns without meaning to. Laura walked with the careful economy of someone who measured her energy. Shoulders pulled back, a slight stiffness in her lower back when she bent to pick something up. She'd stand half-turned when she talked, like she was always ready to shift her weight and move on. But her eyes were attentive, steady, and she had a habit of pressing her lips together when she was listening to something serious. Rachel, on the other hand, talked with her hands, her fingers always in motion, tracing shapes in the air as if she were sketching invisible lines against the backdrop of the mountains. When she laughed, it was bright and quick, filling the cool air around them for a moment, before fading into the sounds of idling engines and the clack of someone's cartwheels. Watching them from my usual distance over the rim of a coffee cup or through a windshield, I saw all the small domestic gestures that mark a long-standing partnership. A shared glance when deciding on groceries, a hand brushing a sleeve, one leaning in to catch a word, the other murmured too softly for anyone else to hear. That fall, they seemed to lean into the season more than usual. On weekdays, when I walked the dog in the late afternoon, I'd see Rachel in the driveway unloading plastic bins filled with art supplies, the smell of acrylic paint and paper glue drifting faintly into the crisp air as she carried them inside. She'd pause sometimes, setting a box down to take a picture of the way the clouds rolled in over the ridge, or how the setting sun just clipped the top of the blue porch, making it glow. On weekends, Laura would be outside fussing over the Subaru, checking the tire pressure, wiping dust from the windshield with a rag that left streaks on the glass. I remember one particular Sunday when the air tasted like coming snow, sharp clean, a hint of something metallic in the back of the throat, and I watched her kneel by the rear bumper to inspect a small crack in the plastic. She ran her hand over it slowly as if she were memorizing it, then straightened with a slight wince and brushed off her jeans. We talked more as the days grew shorter. I'd find myself on my front steps with a jacket zipped up to my neck, listening to the dry scratch of leaves skipping across the sidewalk and the faint hiss of traffic from the highway, when one of them would wave on their way in or out. One evening, as the sky turned the color of bruised peaches and the streetlights hummed to life with that faint electrical buzz, Rachel walked over holding a stack of glossy photographs. The ink smell was strong, warmed by her hands and the cool air. She spread them out on my porch railing, images of students squinting into mountain sunlight, pine needles sharp in the foreground clouds rolling like slow waves over distant ridges. "I'm trying to show them how the light changes up there," she said, her breath a pale puff between us. "It's never the same twice." I nodded, feeling the chill seep through the railing into my palms, and thought how lucky her students were to have a teacher who noticed those shifts. If there were cracks in that smooth surface, they were almost invisible then. Once walking home from town with my scarf pulled up against a biting wind that smelled like snow and exhaust, I saw Laura standing alone on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, staring out toward the dark line of the mountains. The porch light cast a soft circle of yellow around her feet, but her face was shadowed, and from the sidewalk I could hear nothing but the steady rush of the river in the distance and the faint rattle of Patricia's wind chime. She didn't wave that time. She seemed lost in something, jaw-tight fingers tapping lightly against her own elbow. By the time I reached my driveway and turned to look back, she'd gone inside the door, closing with a quiet thud that barely registered over the murmur of the evening. I told myself everyone has those moments when the weight of work and bills and life just presses down. It didn't feel like a warning. Not then. Inside their house, as far as I knew from the occasional glimpse through an open door or a window, left uncurtained, life looked like any other two-person home on our street. Warm lamplight pooled over a cluttered kitchen table, stacks of papers and textbooks piled around a laptop, the muted blue-white flicker of a television in the living room at odd hours when Laura was home between shifts. Sometimes on nights when I couldn't sleep and the neighborhood had gone dark except for a few stubborn porch lights, I'd hear a faint thread of music drifting across the cool air from their place, soft, low, something with a slow beat, and the clink of dishes being set in a sink. The smell of sautéed onions or garlic would ride the breeze drifting past my open window and making my own quiet house feel less empty. Those little domestic sounds were like a heartbeat in the background of my night's proof that somewhere nearby someone was awake and going through the same routines. They talked often about the mountains, even more that October. I remember standing in line behind them at the grocery store, the hum of the coolers blending with the rustle of plastic bags, while Laura checked a list written in a neat, compact hand. I saw canned chili trail mix, instant coffee, and a new flashlight on the conveyor belt, its packaging glossy and bright under the fluorescent lights. Rachel was talking about the first dusting of snow they'd seen higher up the previous weekend, her voice carrying just enough that I could hear the excitement threaded through it. "It's quiet up there," she said, half to Laura, half to herself, as she shifted her weight in worn boots that squeaked faintly against the polished floor. "Like the air's thicker, but in a good way." Laura smiled a small, tired curve at the corner of her mouth and replied so softly I couldn't catch the words, only the rhythm. The store smelled like oranges and floor cleaner, and the cashier's scanner beeped steadily between us, but something about the way Laura was studying that list, checking it twice, stuck with me longer than it should have. The last ordinary evening I remember clearly had a thin edge of cold to it, the kind that makes your fingertips ache if you stay outside too long. The sky was clear, a deep, dark blue that almost looked black above the ridge, and the stars were just starting to show sharp as pins. I was out front taking in the trash cans, metal lids ringing softly, when they bumped against the sides when I saw their porch light on, and both of them moving back and forth between the house and the Subaru. The cargo area was open, the interior light glowing a soft, warm yellow against the dark, and I could hear the rustle of nylon as they shifted sleeping bags and a tent inside. Boxes slid across the plastic floor with a low scrape, and once or twice I caught their voices in fragments, Rachel laughing at something, Laura responding with a quieter tone, the words broken up by the faint buzz of a distant airplane overhead. The smell of gasoline and cold air mixed around the driveway, and when Patricia stepped out to toss a bag into her own trash bin. The three of them traded a few easy words I couldn't quite make out. After a while, the yard fell quiet again. I rolled the last trash can against the side of my house, the rubber wheels bumping over a crack in the concrete, and stood for a moment just listening. The street was still no cars passing, no dogs barking, only the distant hush of the river and the bare branches of the trees scratching lightly against one another when the breeze picked up. Their porch light stayed on, casting its familiar circle of soft gold onto the steps, but the front door remained closed and no more voices drifted out into the night. I remember glancing down at my phone, seeing the time, and thinking I'd call my daughter the next evening when things were quieter, when I was in the right frame of mind. Then I slipped inside, letting my own screen door clap shut behind me with a hollow, familiar snap, unaware that out there, just beyond the glass, that same porch light would keep burning longer than it should have, shining on an empty driveway and a dark street that suddenly felt a shade too silent. I remember the moment the quiet began to feel wrong. It was early evening, the sun already sliding behind the ridge, leaving the street in that soft, bluish half-light that comes just before full dark. I had stepped outside to bring in the last of the recycling bins, the plastic still cold from the afternoon wind, when I glanced toward the house with the blue porch. Their light was still on. That wasn't unusual on its own. Plenty of folks let porch lamps run longer in October, but something about the stillness around that house made me pause. No laughter drifting from inside. No car easing into the drive. Just the yellow glow on empty steps and the muted hum of electricity in the crisp air. I stood there for a moment, rubbing my thumb across the cold rim of the bin, trying to tell myself it meant nothing. People run late. People get caught up. But a small knot no larger than a stone settled low in my gut and didn't leave. The next morning started as plainly as any other. Frost turned the grass stiff and silver, and the cold smelled faintly of iron. I poured my coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and listened to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood beginning to stir. A car door down the street. Somebody's dog shaking its collar. A jay cutting through the air with that harsh cry they make when the weather shifts. But I didn't hear Rachel's car door at 7:15. No shuffle of her boots on the gravel. No soft murmur of her radio as she paused to warm up the Subaru. I kept glancing at the clock, telling myself she must have taken a personal day or driven in early for something at school. Still, I found myself stepping to the window more than once, mug in hand, searching for movement at their place. Around mid-morning, I walked out to check my mail breath hanging in the air like faint smoke. The blue porch remained quiet. A thin sheet of frost clung to the railing untouched. That's when Patricia stepped outside her house with a half-full trash bag, her sweater pulled tight around her shoulders. She gave me a nod but looked troubled, her eyes drifting to the stillness next door. "Haven't seen them this morning," she said, barely above a whisper. Her voice carried that hesitant edge people get when they don't want to give shape to a bad thought. I shrugged, trying to keep my tone light. "Probably left early," I said. But we both stood there a few seconds longer than necessary, the cold working its way through our sleeves, neither of us fully convinced by my words. The afternoon passed slowly. Too slowly. I tried reading on the couch, but every sound tugged my attention back toward the window. A passing truck, someone's screen door shutting. Each time I'd lift my head, thinking maybe the Subaru had returned without my noticing, but their driveway stayed empty. By late afternoon, the sky had that washed-out look it gets before the sun drops, pale blue streaked with thin clouds, and a chill crept through the seams of my jacket. I walked the dog past their house, pretending it was part of our usual route, but really I just wanted to see if there was any sign of life inside. The curtains were open the way they often left them during the day, but no movement passed through the rooms. A mug sat on the kitchen counter near the window, catching a faint reflection from the street light that clicked on early because of the short day. That single mug, sitting out like someone had set it down in a hurry, stuck with me. I can't explain why. It wasn't unusual. People leave dishes out all the time. But it gave me a strange feeling, as if whatever morning routine had started there had ended abruptly. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The wind rattled a loose gutter on my front porch, and each time it clanged I jerked awake, unable to shake the sense that something was pressing in from beyond the dark windows. Sometime after midnight I sat up and pulled back the curtain. Their porch light was still on, casting a warm circle across the top step. Beyond that, the driveway was empty, the trees along the edge of the road shivering in the wind. I stood there with my hand on the curtain for longer than I care to admit, listening to my own heartbeat in the quiet. I told myself again that it meant nothing, but by morning I knew something was off. The next day dawned colder, the air sharp with the smell of wet leaves and early snow from higher up in the mountains. I brewed coffee, but it tasted thin. My stomach had that restless, unsettled feeling that used to come before big news at the school where I used to work. I stepped outside to get some air. The light was soft and gray, and the street felt unusually still. No distant chatter, no engine noises, just the hush of wind moving through the bare branches. And that's when I saw the sheriff's cruiser rolling slowly down our road, the tires crunching lightly over a patch of gravel near the storm drain. At first I assumed it was routine. We get patrols from time to time when there's been a break-in or a lost hiker up in the hills, but the cruiser slowed as it approached the blue porch, then stopped. The deputy who stepped out was a young man I'd seen at the grocery store now and then, broad-shouldered, polite, always nodding when he passed. He walked up the front steps with a pace that was too careful, too measured. He knocked. Waited. Knocked again, this time a bit louder. I took a step toward my own fence hand resting on the cool metal rail and called out, "Everything all right?" He glanced my way, his breath visible in the cold. "Just checking on something," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a tightness around his eyes. He tried the doorbell, the faint chime carrying across the yard. When no one answered, he stepped back and lifted his radio, speaking in a low voice I couldn't make out. A moment later, as I stood there with the dog's leash wrapped around my wrist, Patricia came out onto her porch. She clutched her cardigan around her like the cold had teeth, and she didn't look away from the deputy. "They still not home?" she asked me quietly. I shook my head. "Not since yesterday morning." Her mouth pulled into a thin line. "That's not like them." The deputy walked over, boots crunching on the thin layer of frost-slicked leaves that had gathered near the curb. He introduced himself, Deputy Mills, and asked whether either of us had seen the women since the day before. I told him the truth. I hadn't seen their car return, hadn't heard the familiar sounds from their porch, hadn't caught any hint of movement inside their windows. He nodded slowly, listening carefully, eyes drifting to the house as if something inside might shift while we stood there. The cold seemed to settle deeper into the morning, the kind that cuts through fabric and settles in your bones. "We got a call," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "Up near Molas Pass. Someone found a vehicle that matches theirs." The street seemed to tilt beneath me for a moment, just a fraction, as if the world had taken in a breath and held it. My mind tried to piece together what that meant, an abandoned vehicle far from town, up on one of those winding roads, where a person could feel like they were the last soul on earth. Patricia pressed a hand to her chest. Did someone get hurt?" she asked, her voice cracking just a little. "We don't know yet," he said. His breath came out in a thin cloud. "But the car was unattended, and we're trying to reach their families." I felt the dog tug faintly at his leash, wanting to keep walking, but my feet wouldn't move. A low hum filled my ears like the steady drone of the streetlight on summer nights, except it was daytime and the cold didn't soften it. I swallowed hard. Unattended, how I asked, though part of me already wished I hadn't. He hesitated only a moment. Just empty. Doors locked. Another breath. Personal things inside. The breeze picked up then, carrying the distant scent of snow and pine resin from higher in the mountains. It brushed against the back of my neck and made me shiver. Patricia whispered something too soft to catch, and I realized I was gripping the cold metal of my fence so tightly that my knuckles ached. Deputy Mills thanked us for the information and returned to his cruiser, speaking again into the radio before pulling slowly away. The sound of the engine faded down the street until all that remained was the soft hiss of the wind moving through the nearly bare trees. I stood there for a long time, the dog sitting patiently at my side. The sky had shifted to a dull, heavy gray, and the cold felt closer somehow, like it had crept into every quiet space on the block. Across the street, their porch light still burned its gentle yellow glowing against the daylight in a way that felt wrong, too warm, too steady, like it didn't realize no one was coming home to switch it off. And as I watched that light blink faintly in the wind, I knew without knowing how that whatever had begun with a simple missed morning routine had now slipped into something far heavier, something none of us yet had a name for. The morning the real search began, the air had that brittle October sharpness, the kind that sits on your skin before the sun finds its footing. I walked outside just as the first sheriff's SUV rolled up its engine, rumbling low, the headlights still on, even though daylight had technically arrived. A second vehicle followed close behind, then a third, unmistakable signs that whatever hope we'd held on to the day before had thinned into something more serious. Deputies stepped out wearing heavy jackets, their breath showing in the cold, their expressions set in that steady, practiced way law enforcement gets when they're bracing for long hours. One of them carried a clipboard tucked under his arm. Another had a roll of bright orange tape swinging from his belt, and the sight of that tape meant to mark search boundaries made the pit in my stomach drop even further. For the first time, I understood this wasn't going to resolve itself with a simple phone call or a car pulling quietly into a driveway. The weight of it settled through the street like a slow, sinking fog. I moved closer, keeping to the edge of my property so I wouldn't get in the way. The hum of engines, the shuffle of boots over cold pavement, the muted click of radios coming to life. It all sounded strangely loud against the silence of our neighborhood. Patricia was already outside, wrapped in a coat she hadn't bothered to button, arms held tight across her chest. She didn't speak, just stood there watching as the deputies walked toward the house with the blue porch. One of them knocked again, more out of protocol than expectation. The sound echoed down the street sharp and hollow. No answer, of course. Not long after, 2 more trucks arrived, Forest Service vehicles this time. The doors opened and out stepped rangers and volunteers. People who knew the San Juan backcountry like an old friend. They stretched out stiff limbs, pulled hats lower over their ears, and gathered near the back of a truck where someone had already started unfurling a topographic map. I could see the trail lines from where I stood splayed across the hood like a complicated web of ridges, valleys, and unmarked spaces. The air smelled faintly of exhaust and cold dirt, and occasionally the wind carried the soft jingle of a dog's collar from where a K9 unit paced in the grass waiting. That's when it hit me, this wasn't just a neighborhood concern anymore. It had become an operation, a full-scale effort. When you live in a small town long enough, you learn that it takes a lot to move this many people this early in the day toward the same direction. Something deep inside me, something instinctive and unwelcome, whispered that we had crossed a line we couldn't walk back from. By late morning, the teams were forming up at the edge of the road. The cold had softened just a bit, enough to lift the breath from their mouths, but not enough to warm anyone's hands. Deputies checked radios, clipped them to vests, and tested the frequencies with short bursts of static. One ranger kneeled beside a search dog, brushing a gloved hand along the animal's back as it trembled with anticipation. I watched the dog lift its nose, drawing in the scents carried on the thin mountain air. Pine-old leaves, damp earth, and then looked toward the trailhead as if it already knew that its work lay somewhere in the tangled shadows of those ridges. I stood with Patricia for a while, both of us silent. Words felt too small, too fragile. Every so often a deputy would ask if we remembered anything unusual from the past couple of days, but there wasn't much more to say. The porch light left on the empty driveway, the quiet that felt a little too heavy. There's a peculiar kind of helplessness that settles over you when the people who know how to search take over. It isn't that you're unwelcome, it's that you realize how little you can do. How you're suddenly just another pair of eyes standing behind the line hoping for something neither good nor bad, just something. A little after noon, the first teams headed up into the mountains. The engines of the trucks roared to life, sending up little clouds of exhaust that drifted along the road before dissolving into the cold. Tires crunched over gravel, radios crackled with directions, and then the trucks disappeared one by one into the winding path that led higher into the San Juans, their taillights blinking out like matches being snuffed by wind. The stillness they left behind felt unnatural, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. The hours that followed stretched long and slow. I walked back inside, made a pot of coffee that tasted too bitter, and found myself drifting from window to window as if movement would settle my nerves. Watching the light change on the mountains became a kind of clock, the sun shifting from bright white to pale gold, to the muted, milky glow that comes before it slips away entirely. Every once in a while, a search vehicle would return its tires, throwing small stones across the pavement. Someone would get out, stretch tired arms, talk quietly with another deputy, and then head back toward the woods with a fresh team. That cycle repeated again and again, like waves rolling in and pulling back without bringing much of anything ashore. I walked down the street around mid-afternoon, wanting to be closer, but not wanting to intrude. At the trailhead just outside town, I found a small gathering of volunteers, a college kid in a windbreaker too thin for the cold, a retired couple from 3 blocks over a middle-aged man with a handheld radio clipped to his backpack. Their faces were pale from the wind, their boots dusted with the fine powder of early-season snow that collected in the higher elevations. The rangers briefed them quietly, pointing to sections of the map that fanned out across the bed of a pickup truck. I caught words like grid drainage and blind corners, but they all seemed to belong to another world, one just far enough beyond my reach that it felt surreal. Search dogs worked the area near the road first. One dog picked up something, a quick jerk of its head, a short whine, but then the trail vanished almost immediately, swallowed by damp earth and patches of melting snow. A false lead. The handler shook his head gently, giving the dog a reassuring rub behind the ears before moving on. I watched that moment, the dog's brief spark of focus followed by disappointment, and felt a heaviness settle across my shoulders. Every potential clue felt like a tiny flare in the dark, and every one that went out left us deeper in the shadows. Not long after someone radioed in a possible sighting, a piece of dark fabric caught on a branch near one of the switchbacks. A buzz of movement followed volunteers and deputies shifting with new purpose boots hitting the trail with fresh urgency. I held my breath as they disappeared around the bend, my fingers numb despite the gloves I'd put on. But when they returned, they held nothing. Just a scrap of tarp torn and stiff from the cold, probably left by another hiker weeks ago. Another flare gone. As the afternoon deepened, the rumors began. They always do in small towns. Someone whispered that they must have gotten lost in the early snow. Someone else insisted they had probably taken an unmarked path. There are plenty of them up there and slipped into a ravine. A shopkeeper downtown told a customer that she'd heard they might have decided to camp off route. Another man claimed he saw something unusual the night before, though by the time the story made its way to me, the details had already drifted like smoke. Folks meant well, but I could feel the fear underneath their words. It was in the way they lowered their voices, in the way their eyes avoided the mountains whenever they spoke. Back at the staging area, the deputies stayed controlled, professional. But even from a distance, I caught small gestures that unsettled me. A deputy who rubbed his palms together too many times. Another who kept looking toward the tree line as if expecting something to emerge, a ranger who paused mid-sentence and pressed his lips tight. Those quiet moments said more than anything spoken aloud. Theories took shape and dissolved just as quickly. Maybe they'd followed a trail and been caught by sudden weather plausible in late October. Maybe they'd run into someone on those back roads less likely, but not impossible. Or maybe their car hadn't been the starting point of the trouble at all. Maybe something had happened before they ever reached the mountains. Each idea felt heavy as stone and none fit comfortably. As dusk crept across the valley, the air turned colder, cutting through my coat. The faint smell of pine smoke drifted from a house farther down the road, mingling with the sharper scent of snow carried on the wind. One of the search coordinators walked past me, a radio in hand, his expression pinched with exhaustion. I heard a faint burst of static from the device, followed by a soft voice giving coordinates I didn't understand. He nodded, made a mark on his map, and stepped back toward his truck. His boots left crisp, shallow impressions in the dirt that were quickly softened by the wind. I lingered at the edge of the clearing, hands pushed deep into my pockets. The mountains loomed dark and massive above us, their silhouettes growing sharper as the last light drained from the sky. Somewhere out there, people were moving through narrow gullies and wooded slopes with flashlights cutting thin beams through the dusk. And down here, on level ground, the rest of us waited. Waiting has its own kind of weight, a slow, grinding pressure that sits right behind the ribs. Just when I was about to turn back toward home, a ranger approached the search coordinator with something clutched in his gloved hand. I couldn't see what it was, not clearly, but the coordinator's posture shifted. He straightened. He wiped a bit of dust from the map with the side of his thumb. Then he spoke quietly into his radio, his breath turning white in the cooling air. Whatever he said made the nearby deputies stop what they were doing. One lifted his head sharply. Another switched frequencies on his radio with quick, practiced movements. The atmosphere tightened, not panicked, not dramatic, just tense in a way that made the fine hairs along my arms rise beneath my jacket. The ranger and coordinator stepped closer to the map, the object still held carefully between them. And though I couldn't hear their words, I could tell from their faces that the search was about to shift again, deeper, sharper into territory none of us had wanted to imagine. I remember the exact moment the search changed. It was late afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything look a little washed out, as if the day itself is growing too tired to hold color. I was standing near the staging area, a paper cup of lukewarm coffee in my hands, when a burst of static shot through the radios lined up on a truck hood. It wasn't the usual chatter or routine check-in. This was sharper and urgent clipped voice that made every head turn at once. The rangers nearby stopped mid-step. One of the deputies instinctively reached up and lowered the volume, leaning in as though getting closer would help him make sense of the words. I couldn't hear what was said, not exactly, but I caught enough to feel the ground shift beneath my feet. A location, a number, a tone that carried something cold. The coordinator, an older ranger with a lined face and a steady way about him, straightened, grabbed his pack, and began issuing instructions. His voice stayed firm, but the urgency threaded through it like a thin wire pulled tight. Within seconds, several deputies were moving toward the vehicles that lined the narrow gravel turnout. The bass-heavy thump of doors shutting echoed across the clearing. Even the search dogs sensed something had changed. One let out a short, anxious whine as its handler knelt to clip the leash tighter. I felt my pulse pick up the way it does when you sense a truth forming before you can name it. I didn't know what they had found or how serious it was, but my body reacted before my mind could catch up. A heaviness bloomed low in my stomach. My fingers tightened around the coffee cup until the rim buckled inward. The cold air, which had been biting all day, suddenly felt thinner and harder to draw in. They were headed toward a spot not far from one of the old service roads that used to lead miners in and out of the mountains, a place where the ridges folded over each other in tight shadowed lines. It didn't mean much to me then. Those hills hold hundreds of forgotten corners, some natural, some carved out by hands long gone. But seeing the convoy of trucks snake up the road, dust rising behind them, made something inside me brace without knowing why. I drove behind them at a respectful distance, following the curve of the road as it climbed away from town. The higher we went, the quieter everything grew. The sound of wind through dry branches replaced the hum of traffic. Patches of old snow clung to shaded ground, crunching under boots when we stepped out near the marked point. The air smelled of cold stone and damp leaves, a mineral scent that only comes from those high mountain pockets where sunlight struggles to reach. Deputies had already set out flags marking a path down a faint slope scattered with loose rock. A couple of rangers stood near the entrance to what looked at first glance like just another rock wall. But as I got closer, I realized something was off. A portion of the hillside looked too smooth, too intentional. One of the workers from the road crew, still wearing an orange vest streaked with dirt, pointed out a section where the stone had given way earlier that day when their equipment cut too close. Beneath the fallen rocks, you could see a brick-like structure, old, rough, and more out of place than anything should be that deep in the mountains. Someone shined a light across the area. The beam caught the edge of a narrow opening, partly cleared, partly still choked with rubble. Cold air seeped out from the darkness inside a colder air than the afternoon chill around us. It carried a smell I can still recall, metal damp earth and something like old machinery. Not strong, not foul, just ancient in a way that didn't belong out here. I watched as they worked the debris more carefully this time, piece by piece, until the opening widened into a low passage framed by brick on both sides. The bricks were dark, dried with years of condensation. Some crumbled under the slightest touch. The deputies exchanged careful looks, their flashlights cutting through the shadows that pooled just inside. Then the coordinator gave a nod, and they stepped in. I stayed back. I'm not sure I could have gone in even if they'd asked me to. The moment the lights disappeared into that narrow corridor, a cold ripple worked its way down my spine. The air outside was silent except for the occasional scrape of rock under someone's boot. We waited. The minutes stretched. Every so often, a muffled voice echoed from deeper inside short instructions, calls for more light, a request for someone to bring equipment. Then came the radio call. Quiet, almost too quiet. A deputy stepped backward out of the passage, walked toward the coordinator, and spoke in a voice so low I couldn't hear the words. But I saw the expression change, the tightened jaw, the way he exhaled through his nose, steady but strained. He lifted a hand and signaled for more personnel. I don't remember moving, but I found myself closer than before, standing a few paces from the entrance. The cold rolling out of that tunnel touched my face like a faint, unwelcome breath. My fingertips tingled. My knees felt uncertain. And then, one of the investigators stepping back through the narrow opening carried something out. A rusted metal piece jagged at one side as if part of a larger object had been forced or broken. Attached to it was a scrap of hardened yellowed material that looked like old plastic sheeting. It didn't mean much to me then, but it meant something to them. The deputy handling it treated it with a care that sent a cold signal through the crowd. Another investigator followed with a flashlight trained downward, illuminating a line of disturbed dust near the threshold. A third came out holding a heavy glove to his chest, one that looked like it had been pulled from inside the chamber. He didn't lift his eyes as he walked. The rest of us stayed quiet. Even the wind seemed to hush. After several minutes, one of the deputies told us to stay back as they cleared more space at the entrance. I stepped away, letting the weight of what was happening sink into my bones. The cold air around me felt thicker, as if the mountain itself was holding something close. When they finally allowed a few of us to look from a safer distance, I followed, though my legs felt stiff. The corridor inside led down to a small room carved out of the earth concrete walls stained with moisture, a ceiling low enough that taller men had to duck. The floor was covered with a thin layer of dust and rust flakes that shifted under the beams of flashlights. And in the center of that room sat a metal safe, or what had once been one. The lid was warped upward, its hinges corroded the whole surface, mottled orange and brown from years of contact with damp air. A ranger crouched beside it, shining his flashlight along the crack where the lid had split. The beam reflected off something plastic tucked just inside. They worked slowly to lift the lid the rest of the way, mindful not to disturb anything. When it finally came loose with a groan of protesting metal, the smell that rose up was cold and stale, like air trapped for years, heavy with rust and decay. Inside was a sealed plastic bag fogged with moisture, protecting a small hardbound notebook. Its edges were yellowed, the corners softened by time, but the writing on the first page was untouched. Clear, legible. A name. I felt the world pull inward at that moment, as if all the oxygen in the room had shifted. The investigators didn't speak right away. They simply stared at the notebook, the cold beams of their flashlights glinting off the thin plastic around it. One of the deputies swallowed hard and stepped back, letting the forensic team move in. I don't know how long we stood there, watching, breathing in that chilled air, waiting for someone to say what none of us wanted to hear. But eventually, one of the senior investigators glanced toward the rest of us gathered near the entrance. He didn't need to speak. His eyes carried the weight. Later that evening, after the site had been cordoned off and the notebook carefully transported back to town, the sheriff held a briefing at the edge of the trail. The sun was nearly gone, leaving a pale lavender band across the sky. The cold settled deeper into the valley, carrying with it the sharp scent of snow from the peaks above. The lights from the sheriff's trucks cast long beams across the dirt, making the dust sparkle like frost. He explained that the notebook was genuine handwritten and dated from the days immediately following the women's disappearance. It described confinement underground, a locked door, the sound of movement overhead. And then, silence. Listening to him speak, I felt myself drift as though my mind couldn't hold all the pieces at once. The realization that they hadn't been lost in the wilderness. They hadn't walked away. They hadn't simply vanished into the mountains. They had been taken below them. The families arrived soon after. I saw them from a distance, faces pale beneath the harsh beams of portable lights, shoulders drawn in tight breaths, short and visible in the cold. Words passed between them and the sheriff, quiet but weighted. One of the mothers touched the deputy's arm, her hand trembling. Another stood very still, staring toward the dark outline of the ridges. As for me, I stayed at the edge of the clearing, uncertain what to do with the heaviness settling across my chest. The cold seeped deeper into my coat, into my hands, into my breath. I felt rooted in place, as if moving would somehow break the fragile surface of the moment. When the last team emerged from the passage and marked it off with tape, the light from their flashlights flickered across the ground like distant signals. Radios buzzed with instructions about securing the site overnight. The wind carried the low murmur of voices down the hill, mixing with the rustle of dry grass. Eventually, they began gathering for the night's debriefing back in town. I walked to my truck in a daze, the gravel soft under my boots, the cold steering wheel stiff beneath my fingers. As I drove behind the convoy of vehicles winding back toward Durango, their brake lights glowing red through the gathering dark, I knew the weight of what we'd found wouldn't lift any time soon. By the time we reached the sheriff's office, the windows were lit from inside, casting squares of pale yellow onto the pavement. Reporters were already gathering their breath, rising in wisps as they set up cameras. Deputies moved with purpose, faces drawn radios clipped tight against their jackets. I parked and stepped out, the night settling around me like a heavy coat. The cold stung my cheeks. The air smelled faintly of exhaust dust and something else, anticipation maybe. The kind that comes before a truth is spoken aloud. I stood there for a moment, watching as the sheriff prepared to step up to the microphones, his shoulders squared against what he had to say. Behind him, the doorway to the briefing room glowed softly, a rectangle of light opening into a night that felt suddenly much darker than before. In the hours after the notebook was carried out of that bunker, everything around the sheriff's office took on a strange, suspended feeling. The hallways were lined with deputies speaking in low voices, the kind people use in hospital corridors or funeral homes. The overhead lights hummed faintly, casting a pale glow over the maps taped to the walls and the photographs tacked beside them. I stood near the entrance for a while, my coat still smelling faintly of the cold underground air we'd breathed earlier. Every so often, someone walked past with a clipboard or a sealed evidence bag, and each time a door opened, a draft of warm, indoor air mixed with the mountain chill still clinging to my clothes. It all felt unreal, like stepping between two worlds that refused to settle into one. The families were taken to a quieter room. I only caught brief glimpses, shoulders hunched inward, hands trembling around paper cups, tear-glossed eyes fixed on whatever the sheriff was explaining. The sound of muffled crying carried down the hall, soft but steady. A deputy closed the door gently, as if even the latch might be too loud. I stood there watching the frosted window in that door for a moment, feeling a heaviness open inside my chest. It's one thing to fear an answer. It's another to face it. That truth felt close in those walls, heavy enough to bow the air. News traveled quickly through Durango that night. By the time I drove home, the local station was already reporting that a significant discovery had been made in the mountains. I could see the bluish light of televisions flickering in windows as I passed house after house. People were standing on porches, pulling their coats tight, talking quietly among themselves, while glancing at the ridge as if expecting some shape to appear against the dark sky. The wind had settled, leaving the night oddly still, and the smell of cold pine drifted through open car windows as I drove. I felt each breath almost too clearly, like the air itself was reminding me that life keeps going even when your mind is stuck in a single moment. Over the next few days, the bunker site became a restricted zone. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind, tossing thin shadows across the ground. A small generator hummed through the evenings, powering floodlights that cast pale cones of light across the rocks and dried grass. Investigators came and went at all hours, carrying tools, cameras, sealed containers. I watched some of it from a distance. There wasn't much else I could do, but the sight of the bunker's entrance, now fully uncovered, stayed with me. The brick walls looked almost ancient under the bright lights, their edges softened by time, but still standing firm like something meant to be forgotten but refusing to disappear. In town, conversations shifted from worry to grief and then to something quieter. Not acceptance, more like resignation. People walked through the grocery store aisles slower than usual, their eyes lingering too long on nothing in particular. At the coffee shop, the steam from espresso machines mixed with the low murmur of customers speaking in careful tones. No one asked the loud questions anymore. They just waited for answers from the sheriff's office, each new detail hitting like a weight on already tired shoulders. I followed the updates closely. The diary from the bunker, written in Laura's hand, was authenticated. Page after page confirmed that she and Rachel had been kept underground, alive, for longer than any of us had dared imagine. Investigators determined that the bunker was deliberately concealed. Someone built that entrance, walled it up, vented it, maintained it long enough for the air to circulate, even if only barely. But whoever had done it was gone. There were no fingerprints, no fresh footprints, no tools left behind that could be traced. The evidence pointed toward planning secrecy and a kind of knowledge of those mines and tunnels that only a very particular kind of person could have possessed. But the responsible party, whoever they had been, left nothing behind except the silence of hollow rooms and a diary telling us what the women endured. It was a crime without a face, an answer without a culprit. When the sheriff announced that the investigation would remain open but unsolved until new evidence came in, there was a collective stillness across town. People nodded, sighed, looked at the ground. Everyone felt the same thing: the truth had been found, but justice would not come with it. The families held a small gathering at the park near the river not long after. Dozens of people showed up with candles, gloves pulled tight against the cold breath rising into the early evening air. The river ran high that night, carrying a deep, steady sound that seemed to echo through the trees. The candles flickered in the wind, little pockets of gold swaying against the dark. I stood near the back, hands in my coat pockets, listening to the river and the hushed voices around me. At one point, the breeze shifted, carrying the scent of pine and cold stone. It reminded me of the bunker air, and I felt my throat tighten. In the weeks that followed, life in Durango tried to resume its shape, but something fundamental had shifted. The trailheads that once felt like easy escape points now carried an uneasy quiet. People still hiked, but always in twos or threes, talking louder than before, not letting silence stretch as long. The early winter air, usually sharp and refreshing, held a different kind of cold one that seemed to settle deeper in the nerves. Even the Saturday market felt changed. Vendors still smiled and sold apples and jars of jam, but their eyes flicked toward the mountains more often, as if expecting something to move in the distance. For me, small things lingered. I noticed the porch light on the blue house stayed on longer after the families collected the last of Laura and Rachel's belongings. Maybe they left the bulb there intentionally, or maybe someone forgot it. Either way, seeing it glow at dusk, steady, warm, stubbornly bright, brought an ache I couldn't quite name. Their house looked empty, but not abandoned. More like it was holding its breath. At night, I sometimes sat on my own porch with a blanket around my shoulders, listening to the wind shift through the bare branches. In those quiet hours, the memory of stepping into that cold underground air would return. The way the dust rose around our flashlights, the chilled smell of old stone and rust, the warped lid of the safe, and the stillness of those pages nestled in plastic. I'd sit there until the cold reached my fingers, trying to make sense of how something so terrible could exist hidden right beneath the earth just a few miles from our everyday lives. With time, the shock loosened, but the sorrow remained. I found myself thinking more about the small things, the sound of Rachel's car door in the mornings, the warm glow of their porch light, the faint music drifting from their kitchen at night. I remembered the way Laura once stood on her porch, arms wrapped around herself, looking toward the mountains without speaking. Back then, I didn't know what that moment meant. Now it plays in my memory like a grainy piece of film, looped and quiet, carrying a weight I wish it didn't. As strange as it sounds, I learned something about presence from all this. How people leave impressions in the spaces they touch, their footsteps on the sidewalk, their voices carried on evening air, the way their shadows fall along the porch or sidewalk at just the right hour. Even when they're gone, those impressions stay. You feel them when the wind dies down and the town grows still. You hear them in the hush that settles between passing cars. You sense them in the low rumble of a train working its way north. Months later, the bunker was sealed again. A fresh layer of stone and earth settled over it, closing off that narrow passage. But I still think about what lay behind it, about how the cold inside that room held onto its secrets for so long. The mountains look the same from a distance, strong, unmoved, majestic in the morning light. But now I see them differently. I see the shadows deeper than they appear, the silence thicker, the ground heavier with stories it will never willingly give up. If I had to leave you with one image, one that still sits with me even now, it would be the notebook itself, small, unassuming, wrapped in plastic, resting in the hands of a deputy under the harsh beam of a flashlight. The way the light caught its edges, the way the letters on the first page seemed to glow despite the dust. It wasn't just evidence. It was a final message brought out of the dark by accident, something that refused to stay buried. And sometimes, late at night, I think that's what truth really is, a quiet, stubborn thing that rises when the world least expects it. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.